Hello everyone, so we are starting the pharynx, and you know the pharynx is a wide muscular tube, obviously, and the fact that it is situated behind the nose, behind the mouth, and behind the larynx, right? And it is technically considered a part of the upper respiratory passages, and so infections are common over here. Now, the upper part of the pharynx, this is the upper part of the pharynx. The upper part of the pharynx transmits only air. The middle part of the pharynx, which is this part over here, transmits both air and food. Air from here, food from the oral cavity, right? And the lower part of the pharynx, this is the lower part of the pharynx, will be transmitting only food because the air will go in this direction into the larynx and then into the trachea. So that is an MCQ-ish point. Now, certain important things is that the pharynx is a 12 centimeters long muscular tube. So this is the first trivia you should know. The length of the pharynx is not hard to remember. It is often asked in MCQs, so it is 12 centimeters long. This distance in between these 2 points is 12 centimeters, just so you have an idea of this, right? And we also have to talk about the width. The width of the pharynx is going to be different in different parts. It is my apologies. It is widest above about 3.5 centimeters. It gets progressively narrower and is narrowest the lowest down. This is obviously the narrowest part. Right, now let's talk about the divisions. We divide the pharynx into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So we have to talk about the situation. The part of the pharynx behind the nasal cavity is the nasopharynx. The part behind the oral cavity, this is the tongue, and you can see the edges of the mouth. So this part is the oropharynx, and the part behind this is the epiglottis. This is the representing the laryngeal cartilages, and the part behind this part actually is the laryngopharynx. Now let's talk about the extent. Right, so starting with the nasopharynx. So extent from the base of the skull. This all is a cross section of the base of the skull, and so it's going from the base of the skull to the soft palate. This is my representation of the soft palate. So the part of the pharynx between the base of the skull and the soft palate is the nasopharynx. This is the base of the skull. This is the soft palate, and the part in between is the nasopharynx. Base of the skull, soft palate. The soft palate and the hard palate divide the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Now, which part of the base of the skull specifically? And this is a suture. This is the part of the body of the sphenoid, and this is part of the basio-occiput or the basilar part of the occipital bone. So that is some details that you should probably be aware of. Now the communications. Obviously, there is an anterior communication over here with the nasal cavity. Below you can see this communication with the oropharynx. So that is something to be considered. As for the nerve supply, the nasopharynx is supplied by the pharyngeal branches of the pterygopalatine ganglia. In this particular image, you can see this is the maxillary nerve. This over here is the pterygopalatine ganglia. Now, when you've talked about the ganglia, for example, you might have talked about the ciliary ganglia. You might have talked about the otic ganglia, which hangs from the lingual nerve, if I'm not mistaken. Right, and you've talked about all of those ganglias, and you've talked about the submandibular ganglia as well. Anyways, so that was hanging from the mandibular nerve, and this one is hanging from the maxillary nerve, interestingly. And when we talked about the various relations of it, we considered the superior salivatory nucleus and the inferior salivatory nucleus. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. You can see that there are the pharyngeal branches of the maxillary nerve through the pterygopalatine ganglia, and those are responsible for supplying the nasopharynx. Anyways, talking about the relations. So, in front we have this part, which is the posterior nasal aperture, right? And talking about the posterior and the roof of the nasopharynx, we have the body of the sphenoid. This is the body of the sphenoid. So in the posterior and the roof of the nasopharynx, we have the body of the sphenoid with the sphenoid sinus. We have the basi-occiput, and we have the anterior arch of the first cervical vertebrae, and these are forming the posterior wall and the roof of the nasopharynx. And because this is a sagittal section, we can see this structure in one of the lateral walls, and this is depicting the opening of the auditory tube. So that is important. Now another thing is that there is this presence of this tonsil known as the nasopharyngeal tonsil, and this nasopharyngeal tonsil is quite prominent in children. Opening of the auditory tube in the lateral wall, so that is actually a characteristic of the lateral wall of the nasopharynx, right? Opening of auditory tube, and the nasopharyngeal tonsil above, which is actually more prominent in children. So these are the various features of the nasopharynx. Now the lining epithelium is going to be different in all of the pharynxes. Now because this is directly in contact with the nasal cavity, and if you've done histology of the respiratory system, you know that the ciliated columnar epithelium is generally something that you correspond with the respiratory system. So true to that assumption, the lining epithelium of the nasopharynx is ciliated, simple columnar ciliated epithelium, like this, like the way you draw in histology. Right, function is the passage of air, obviously, because it is communicating anteriorly with the posterior nasal aperture. Right, and the extent is from the base of the skull to the soft palate. Now we have the oropharynx, which is from the soft palate to the upper border of the epiglottis. This is the epiglottis. So you must remember that it is upper body of the epiglottis. Now this is the pharyngeal wall, so I should technically not show this. This is the epiglottis, and the extent of the oropharynx is to the upper border of it. Right, now what about the anterior communication? Obviously the anterior communication is with the oral cavity. This is my attempt to depict the tongue. So anteriorly the communication is with the oral cavity, and behind we can see the body of the second and the third cervical vertebrae. This is the second and this is the third cervical vertebrae, and they're behind it. Also there is a feature known as the tonsillar fossa, which contains which tonsil? The palatine tonsil. Tonsillar fossa. And the tonsillar fossa is on the lateral wall, just as the opening of the auditory tube is on the lateral wall. So the tonsillar fossa is a feature of the lateral wall of the oropharynx, whereas the opening of the auditory tube is a feature of the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. The epithelium, true to the epithelium of the oral cavity, is stratified, squamous, non-keratinized. Why non-keratinized? Because keratinization is only found outside of the body. The rest of the passages are non-keratinized. Obviously both air and food will pass in the oropharynx. Now as for the laryngopharynx, it is going to be extending from the upper border of the epiglottis to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage. So upper border of the epiglottis to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage. Let me just label this. This is the lamina of the cricoid cartilage. So I'm hoping the extent of it is now clear to you. And I've actually, let me just use another color. In purple over here we can see the anterior part of it, and this in blue I'm showing the posterior wall of it, right, so that you're not confused. Over here we have the various layers of the pharynx that surround the pharynx or line or make it small. So this is the actual lumen. Now behind the laryngopharynx we mostly have the fourth and the fifth cervical vertebrae, but part of the C3 and part of the C6 cervical vertebrae also support the laryngopharynx. Right, now let's talk about the attachments of the pharynx. Another important thing to notice that the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are supplied by the cranial nerves 9 and 10 and not by the maxillary nerve, which is actually a division of the cranial nerve.